Hello, my name is Barbara Thompson and I'm attending Colorado Christian University, and this is my YouTube video course journal for the class Human Sexuality. And in this video we will be covering the coursework that we have covered so far this class, and I will attempt to answer some questions over that material and articulate my view of healthy sexuality, the pros and cons of using research as the mechanism of the exploration and understanding of the sexuality, the differences in the way that our textbook and the scripture treat sexuality, and what has influenced my view of sexuality. And the first question asked is, what is healthy sexuality? In our book, The Introduction to Human Sexuality by Carroll does give us a definition, but I personally find it a little clinical. Her definition is a general term for the feelings and behaviors of human beings concerning sex. And I suppose that that's adequate as far as it goes. But I found a better definition in my mind in the book, Teaching Children with Down Syndrome About Their Bodies, Boundaries, and Sexuality, a Guide for Parents and Professionals by Terry Couwenhoven, who is a professional sex educator. And on page 1 she says, during an education session many years ago, I invited a group of teens to make distinctions between the words sex and sexuality. One of the participants shared that his mother had taught him that sex was between his legs, but sexuality was between his ears. This teen's mom understood that sexuality is not just about what we do with our bodies, but more about being, about who we are as men and women. Sexuality is broad and includes biological, psychological, social, and cultural components. And I agree with that definition, but I would also add that it has emotional and spiritual components as well. And I think that is a more complete definition of what healthy sexuality is. It is a part of a complete person. Our sexual identity is more than just our biology, more than just our practices. It is part and parcel of who we are as people. And I think we have to look at it from all of the different aspects to have a healthy view of sexuality. And one of the ways of looking at that is through the research that has been conducted over the years. But there are pros and cons of studying of sexuality from a research base and in our understanding of sexuality from that base. And one of the pros is that it does give us more knowledge. We have more knowledge about people's sexual habits and practices, about sexual satisfaction in marriage. And as much as that is a good thing, it can also be deceiving, because just because we have more knowledge doesn't mean we have more wisdom or discernment, or that we make healthier or better choices. I think that we can be in danger of equating knowledge as good, all knowledge, regardless of what we do with it or how it affects our lives. And I think that some of the cons of looking at sexuality from a research base is that not all the research was done in an ethical manner. Not all of the data is reliable. There are several factors with regard to that. Some of it is volunteer bias, because the people who participate, are willing to participate in sexual research, are not generally representative of the general population. There can be difficulties with samples of convenience. They are sometimes not generalizable to the population at large because they're not a random enough sample. For example, some sexual research is done on college campuses, and though we know that some of us are non-traditional in our ages, most undergraduates on campuses are within a narrow range of age. That demographic is, 18 to 24-year-olds. But that data is not necessarily reproducible in 50 to 60-year-olds. And so the results of the data can be interpreted in many different ways. And unfortunately, I think that sometimes the research is driven by an agenda, such as our book pointed out that some of the funding given to sexual research is provided by pharmaceutical and contraceptive companies. So they have a financial interest in certain research findings. Not that the research won't necessarily be reliable, but there is an appearance that there can be a bias there. And so we have to be careful of that when we look at sexuality from a research base. And sometimes we have to be careful of that bias when we look at any source of information, such as our textbooks and the scripture. There are differences in the way the information is presented. The textbook by Carroll treats sexuality and sex functions as just like any other biological function, such as eating or elimination. Something that's not particularly special at all, and that the book attempts to be morally neutral. Nothing's good or bad, it just is, and present it from that standpoint. One thing I did find interesting about the way that the textbook presented its view of sexuality, particularly when it came to the section on communication, is that it was about what do I need and how are my needs going to be met. And that was the goal of the communication, is to make sure that my needs are met. A selfish standpoint. Whereas Arthur, K. Arthur, The Truth About Sex, and Lauren Winner, Real Sex, or The Naked Truth About Chastity, are the other two books that we are referring to, and both of them look at sex from the biblical model, that God invented it, and that because He is the inventor and creator, He gave certain instructions for its proper perspective and place in our lives. And in fact, it goes all the way back to Genesis 1, where human beings, were created male and female and are commanded to be fruitful and multiply. And then in Genesis 2, Eve was created to be a partner to Adam. And the two of them together would be united as one flesh. And that is what we call sex. But the sex came after the commitment to be united together. And so the biblical model is for sex to be part of an exclusive marriage relationship. And it's designed for several functions. Pleasure, procreation, the continuation of the species, and to unite a husband and wife or spouses in an emotional, spiritual, physical connection that should be exclusive and not shared with anyone else. And one thing that struck me and that prompted me to do a little bit more digging into Scripture was the idea that there are boundaries. And our society treats the thought of boundaries or any kind of restriction as a bad thing. But the Bible does say in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1, is to everything there is a season. And let me start again on that. This is the New International Version. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. Everything has its proper place and its proper time. And that is what the Bible teaches us, is that God made everything good. When you go back to Genesis 1, you see that God created everything, and it was good, including sex. It was not considered bad at all. It was our desires as human beings were warped as a result of sin. But in its original state and in its original form, sex was created to be a beautiful, wonderful thing between spouses. And I particularly appreciated what Kay Arthur had to say on the subject. She gave a very good analogy comparing sex in its proper place to Drano. And I know that sounds like a funny comparison, but when she made that comparison, it really struck me as quite appropriate, because the product Drano is designed for a specific purpose, to unclog stop drains. And it is a powerful product, and it does what it's supposed to do. But it is also very dangerous if you use it in a manner that is inconsistent with the instructions on the can. In fact, there's a warning on the can that it is poison. It may be fatal or cause permanent damage if swallowed. As long as you use it for the purpose it was intended and in the way the manufacturer intended it to be used, it does its job. It's great. It takes care of the problem. It makes everything wonderful again. But if you think you know more than the manufacturer, and you can just say, "Oh, I know what I'm doing. I can handle it," and you don't follow the instructions, you can burn yourself. You can blow up the house. You can hurt yourself and other people because you didn't follow the instructions of the manufacturer. And she compared sex to that can of Drano, and I think it's appropriate. God is the manufacturer. He gave us the instructions as how to use it properly, and if we don't, it can cause damage or harm. It's not, if it's used properly, it's a wonderful thing. But when it's misused, then damage and destruction can come in its wake. And it's important that we listen to, in my way of thinking, that we listen to the one who designed it in the first place. The final point that I need to address is what has most influenced my view of sexuality. And I would have to say that in my experiences probably have influenced my view of sexuality more than anything. I came from a broken home. And so growing up in the 70s, I'm sure that I possibly bought into some of the world's view of what is appropriate sexuality. But I did have a good guide in my grandmother who gave me a solid biblical foundation and led me to Christ when I was 12. And I believe that God has put a hedge of protection around me to protect me from some of the more damaging influences that have come against me in my life. And I believe that God has led me in such a way that I have been able to help my children also have a healthy view of sexuality. Wonderful, appropriate in its proper place, but it has a proper place just like anything. Thank you. And that concludes my video journal.